All right, thanks, Amy. Eric Hansen here. So with that, we'll get started this Monday afternoon on fraud and cybersecurity on a great way to start a Monday. So to the slide, a little bit about Eide Bailly, a little bit about our background. So as you can see, we've been serving clients for over 100 years. We're a large firm, 42 offices in 14 states, top 25 CPA firm, but we're much more than a tax and audit firm. We have a variety of consulting services, as Joe and I are going to speak to today. We're going to talk on forensic accounting and cybersecurity and risk and internal control. So much more than audit and tax, which we'll get into today. So a little bit about myself. I am a forensic accounting senior manager. I'm in our Sioux Falls, South Dakota office. I have three specific credentials related to fraud, forensic interviewing, and financial investigations. And today what I'm going to speak to is internal fraud, occupational fraud, and internal risk, asset misappropriation. I'm going to talk about some examples of some recent cases, as well as how to detect these schemes, red flags, and controls. So hopefully when you leave here today, you have a little better idea of the fraud schemes and maybe how to prevent or detect fraud. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Joe to get the presentation started with cybersecurity.
Thanks, Eric. Joe Souza. I'm also based out of the Sioux Falls office, though I work remotely from Charlotte, the Charlotte area. Again, I work on the risk advisory team, so heavy emphasis on the cybersecurity side, multiple certifications, certified information security auditor, certified ethical hacker, and the newest one is a CMMC registered practitioner. It's those clients who need to do business with the Department of Defense. There's a specific assessment that they need to go through. So I've kind of got registered for that. Been with it, Eide Bailly, for about 7 years. Multitude of industries that I work with, all around cybersecurity. So today we're basically talking about, cybersecurity trends, hot topics, issues that we're seeing, and then same, hopefully get into some of the mitigating stuff that you guys can do from a business perspective. So we kind of have our first polling question. So for the group that's out here today, thanks again for joining. Basically, the question is, have you ever been a victim of cybersecurity or had a cybersecurity incident? That could be a data breach, that could be ransomware, kind of anything that would require you guys to kind of roll your incident response teams.
All right. So Joe, here's your first result.
All right. So it looks like, let's see. So 39% of you have had an actual cybersecurity incident. That's interesting. 54 no's, 7 that could be probably not sure, just didn't want to answer. So that's kind of, some of the stats you'll see here, that 39% is a little low, but again, this is a small sampling of the organizations that are out here. So let's just kind of step right into this. We've got a lot of information to kind of cover, and I want to give Eric enough time to talk from the fraud perspective as well. So, just looking at what is cybersecurity, right? It's an ever-changing landscape. A lot of people say, it's a journey, not a destination, right? You're never going to truly be able to mitigate all of your risks that's out there. There's a lot of definitions that get really granular and how they're defining what cybersecurity is, right? But to me, it gets boiled down to its basic concept, and it's just protecting your IT, right? You're protecting your networks, which is your firewalls, your perimeter environment, which is basically what the hackers are doing to try to attack your networks by running scans to see what ports and services are open. Systems, these are going to be your servers, your workstations, even kind of the Internet of Things, we'll talk about a little bit later. And then to me, most importantly, is your data, right? I mean, that's the most important asset that you guys have. Malicious actors will try to disrupt your networks, steal your data. Monitoring is a big thing with them. They can be inside your network for upwards of months. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Ransomware obviously is a big topic these days, and basically what that is, they're ransoming your critical assets for financial gain, also to disrupt business, political means, depending on who's actually attacking you guys. There we go. So on this screen, you kind of see cut and paste a bunch of the latest attacks over the last few months. Some of these you're probably going to be really familiar with. There's that Colonial Pipeline, $5 million in ransom that was paid to the hackers. That disrupted, obviously, pretty much getting gas anywhere down in the south area, which I'm actually in right now. Things seem to be back to normal, but I know for about 30 days, there was a period where, there were shortages. I was thinking back to the old days when they were rationing gas. McDonald's was hit with a breach. You may have heard of the attack with JBS, which is that bottom one from CBS, which was the meatpacking plant. They were attacked, dealing with an $11 million ransom. Kaseya, which was an IT vendor, that's another big one that happened mainly. They're vending a lot of the European clients, but there were a few American organizations that were also affected with that. So these are probably the most popular ones. Later in the presentation, we'll talk a little bit more, like a specific one that I actually went through in my own career. And the reality is, with this, you're seeing public organizations, private organizations, all being attacked, right? So really at this point, it's not, it used to be the adage of, well, I'll never get attacked. Well, it's not if I'm going to get attacked, it's like, when am I going to get attacked at this point? Because the attackers are becoming more and more aggressive these days. So we have some trends. So these are, oops, click happy there, sorry. So there are some trends that we feel that are the most important trends within cybersecurity space right now. And some of these you're going to be very familiar with. First and foremost is ransomware. I mean, it's been the most common of late. It's obviously the most expensive for organizations to deal with. It's very persistent and it's getting more and more sophisticated. 3 or 4 years ago, ransomware, obviously would lock a specific user's workstation. Well, today now they're going after, full server networks. They're going over storage networks, and now they're even being able to encrypt files that may be mapped to a remote site, like a DR type site. So sophistication from a ransomware perspective is becoming more and more aggressive and becoming more and more of a commonplace. Typically, these are coming through from a phishing perspective, right? So the attackers are getting sophisticated in terms of sending out emails. Sometimes they'll make them look like they're coming from somebody from inside. We typically use a lot of these same tactics when we're assessing our own clients. Again, looking at specific things within that email, right? The header, who's actually sending me the email? Are there misspellings in it? It just doesn't look right, right? Why is my CEO telling me I need to wire transfer money to this other vendor? Phishing is just becoming more and more. So obviously we'll talk about some mitigating stuff later on, but obviously your spam filtering needs to be in place. It needs to be up to par in terms of being able to identify what is phishing and what is real emails. Even the ones that are coming through that look real, there's still going to be indicators with who's actually sending that email. It's not going to be coming from specifically somebody inside the organization. Second area of this as well would be kind of the credential compromise. Again, very typical attack vector is usually through phishing. So again, things that we've done in the past when we're assessing our own organizations or clients, we will send out an email and we'll say there's new policies that you need to approve or a new acceptable use, or end of the year, we love to do this one is, the W-2s or, 1099 type stuff. Send these emails out and we have them try to click on a link within that email, but then direct them to a login page that may look similar to like ADP or maybe their own internal HR system. And again, trying to gain their credentials. And then from there, obviously jumping the next step, right? Once we have those credentials, we can then use credentials to log into various, whether it's web-based mail, email, or maybe they have a web application that sits out there that employees have access to, or even maybe their customers. Another common entry point for this is also installing malware of some sort through these phishing attempts. So at this point, we're looking at, from an attack perspective, we're looking at, do you guys have outdated systems in place? Are you still running Windows 7 and Windows 2008? Are there vulnerable patches that are out there? There was just the Microsoft Prince Spruler deal that came out about a month ago, and then there've been some other emergency patches from Microsoft, and not just Microsoft too, right? You have to also look at the third-party apps, right? If you're using virtualization of any sort, VMware and Hyper-V also provide updates on a regular basis. So again, installing malware, again, trying to find a hole into a vulnerable system. Just a recent example, in terms of credential compromise, we had done a web assessment of one of our clients. they're basically a web application. The web application was client facing, so it actually had some client information. And just looking through, looks like they had some coding issues, which again would be another way that we're looking at from an attack perspective of how to gain access. And we're able to, on the URLs line, we're able to actually insert some couple of random characters, and we're able to jump right into their database, and they should be able to flip through and see individual clients one after the other without having to log into the system. It was just a matter of they had a hole in their coding that allowed us access into that system. So keeping that, keeping your systems up to date is obviously going to be very key. The second one is kind of tax sophistication. So in this case, and this will look, if there are IT people here on the call, looking at logs on a day-to-day basis, who's actually doing what we call port scans. So basically, people are constantly scanning your networks or everybody's networks and ranges of IP addresses to see, are there open holes in somebody's network that I can gain access to? Typically, your firewall will log these events, maybe even trigger an alert to IT staff, and then you can obviously have some remediation in terms of blocking access to that from that IP address. Again, targeted ransomware, again, another one where it's kind of a combination of, well, we're going to send a phishing email. And once we have credentials, we'll use those to kind of gain access to these systems. And then kind of on top of the social engineering phishing stuff, there's also vishing, which is phone call based. So a lot of times, we can glean lots of information from just doing standard research, right? Looking through LinkedIn accounts, just online research on a particular company, be able to pull up phone numbers and be able to direct dial these people and gain access to sensitive information. One tactic we use with banks quite a bit we'll research client reviews of that particular financial institution, and then call in as that user and see if we can gain access to our account, maybe get access to change something within the account without providing any of the normal stuff you would normally do. Like when you call your bank or credit card company, they usually ask you for date of birth or social security number, some kind of form of verification. And what we're trying to do is bypass that. And then the last piece of that too would be smishing, which is actually now text-based. I'm sure some of you are getting these kind of weird text alerts with links on it, or text messages with links in them. Obviously, those are, again, another way that attackers are trying to gain information. So they'll probably have you try to log into a specific site. Hey, you are out of warranty, or hey, you've won this cash prize, or maybe it's like an Amazon type of alert. Just, obviously keeping control of, devices and knowing who's calling and who's emailing you. The third bullet there is kind of around the growing attack surface. So everybody kind of knows the simple stuff, right? Networks, servers, workstations, but there are things out there that are just continually growing over time here. And the biggest one is the Internet of Things, right? So, who doesn't have a smart thermometer or thermostat at their house these days? They may actually have those set up from an HVAC perspective at their organization as well to protect the data center and monitor that. Anything you could think of from, thermostats to Ring doorbells, anything that's Wi-Fi enabled, is basically an Internet of Things, and that's very easily can be hacked. So again, ensuring if you have those type of things within your business environment, and regardless, even your home environment at that point, you want to make sure those things are updated, they're locked down to the best of their ability so people can't get access to those. Same goes with, obviously our smartphones, smartwatches. Now I'm even seeing things around, like, I guess the latest craze now is appliances, right? Washing machines, refrigerators, stoves can all be Wi-Fi enabled. Second kind of attack growing surface, and this kind of came in lieu of COVID. Thank you, COVID, is kind of the remote workspace, right? More and more people working remotely. A lot of organizations who weren't prepared, had to kind of rush and get people set up with remote access. Maybe they didn't go through all their proper security controls that they traditionally would have. So obviously monitoring the VPN connections, who's accessing what, those can obviously be attacked quite easily actually from, especially for the people who go to like the Starbucks or the free Wi-Fi's, and then automatically enabling that VPN connection. It's a kind of a good way for an attacker sitting in that same coffee shop that can actually gain access to that connection. So, obviously the business's attack surface, is growing. I think the rise in development of vulnerabilities per se, just to kind of give you an idea. And I looked at some stats from like 2010. There were basically about 110 or 110,000 applications. So basically, think of these as vulnerabilities that were built out. And there's a website called GitHub, which you can actually get a lot of these resources. And the majority of these, 95% of these, are all free. That contained roughly 40,000 or so vulnerabilities that were out in the wild that people could use to try to attack networks. Now we flash forward to 2020. That same site now contains over 200 million of these type of applications, and roughly we're getting about 158,000 vulnerabilities over the course of a year. So you spread that out, over 52 weeks. I mean, there's quite a variant of vulnerabilities that are coming out, and it's hard for these manufacturers like Microsoft and Adobe to keep up with their patches with the amount of vulnerabilities that are out there. From a transformation and security perspective, a lot of people are now looking at, what else can we do to kind of protect our data? So from this perspective, more and more people are going out to the cloud, obviously looking at, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft's Azure network. I mean, there are a few others, and just again, if you're going to go out to that route, obviously do your due diligence, ensure that they have proper controls in place. There've been a lot of breaches, especially on the Amazon front. If you were to go in that space, I would probably prefer you go Microsoft. I think they kind of have the lockdown in terms of, good security controls in place and good server hardening. But in any case, through this, client, you just got to make sure that security controls, security configurations are top priority if you're going to stay in-house or move stuff to the cloud. The last one on this one is just kind of insider threats. This really isn't a new one, but this could really be like a disgruntled employee, somebody who has compromised credentials they may have more permissions than they necessarily need, right? So most companies are concerned with keeping the outside threat actors in, right? So blocking everything coming from the outside, but are you really truly monitoring your internal employees again, right? So if somebody has more access than they need, they can obviously get the information that potentially could be deemed sensitive, critical, and you obviously don't want that type of information leaving the office space. Monitoring and testing of your internal networks for insider threats is always a necessity and should be done. And not doing internal vulnerability scans, but obviously doing due diligence on your employees, user access reviews to ensure people have the access that they need and not more. This is just a slide I threw out here. And again, I know it's pretty small, but basically, if you think of all the different areas of concern, right, and they're just a multitude of vendors that are out here, and we don't endorse any of these. I mean, we work with a lot of these vendors in terms of helping our clients. If you have questions on any of these, feel free to reach out to myself or Eric Pulse, who was originally going to be on the presentation. We can help you out. We either have firsthand experience working in the IT field previously to come into Ideally, or just working with our clients and what they are using today. So how does cybersecurity incidents impact us? So cyber attacks, fastest growing crime in the US. They're definitely increasing in size and sophistication, as we already talked about. The current average cost per cyber attack is roughly, $3 to $4 million. And those costs kind of include forensics fees. Obviously, you're gonna have to bring somebody in to help aggregate your logs, figure out the source destination of where the attack began. These could range into legal fees, PR fees, additional theft insurance, and potentially any remediation or claims back to your clients due to that data breach. Ransomware is the fastest growing type of cybercrime, claims a victim about every 5 seconds. I think that'll continue to get faster over time. I mean, again, it's a very easy way for somebody to go in and get access to your network. 83% of data breaches against small businesses are typically financially motivated, especially in the ransomware realm. Again, these stats are all from 2020. I haven't seen any 2021 stats, but things like the average detection of a malware or malicious breach. Last year alone was about 270 days. Now we're up to 315 days. So, and with that number, typically reading some insider stuff from Mandiant, FireEye, some of the main vendors that are out there from a forensics and malware protection perspective, they could actually be sitting on your network for up to 6 months before even a log attempt is enabled, right? Because they're coming in usually pretty quiet, sniffing around the network. There's really nothing really going on. They're probably using standard ports at that point. So until they start trying to either exfiltrate data or stop services on a particular server, that's typically when you'd know, and that's why that number is pretty high out there. So again, data breaches are costly, and just talking about the small and mid-sized market, a typical cyber attack could range up to, and that should be millions, not 380K. So that should be about $3 to $4 million average cost of a cyber breach. So impacts of the security incidents on a business. I don't want to read through these, but obviously, protecting or ensuring or exposing confidential data. That could be credit card information, bank account information, social security, dates of birth. Inaccessible customer company data typically is like a denial of service where an attacker is looking to take down a web application. Think of your bank as you're logging in. Well, a lot of times they will try to block, run a denial of service where they prevent their clients from accessing their client portal. Business delivery and continuity. So basically, they're looking at not necessarily, taking down a specific site, but actually taking down the whole network. Which can cause obviously brand damage and business loss. This is definitely a strain on internal resources. There are long hours in trying to get systems back up and running, with the potential losses of revenue that could also mean layoffs or some kind of deferrals of employment based on obviously trying to recoup some of the costs. And then just unplanned costs due to a compromised event, which again we kind of talked about. Legal, the regulatory fines, potentially any civil suits if it's a larger type breach. Again, kind of talked about this one. 50% of companies have experienced at least one or more cyber attacks in the last 12 months. And I think if we went back to that first polling question, that was, I believe it was 39% of you guys all responded that you guys have been part of an incident. Again, it could be a very simple incident too, right? It doesn't have to be a full-blown ransomware. It could be, files have left the building, whether they're paper files. Somebody's walked out the door with a large database on a USB key or some kind of external storage device. So quickly talk about preparing for cybersecurity attack. And how are we doing with time here? So get a little bit of time. So obviously the kind of built out this triad here. So obviously assessing, integrating, and maintaining of your networks, right? So assessing your network is to gain visibility, what's out there, kind of that top-down approach. Management needs to have that buy-in. And then once they've bought into, yes, we need to ensure we have the proper security controls in place, then IT can kind of move forward with that. Integrating those solutions and then maintaining them, and just not maintaining those systems, but obviously ensuring that alerting is in place, the proper logging is in place. So if you are part of a breach, you guys are at least notified well in advance. So this all kind of starts with a kind of a culture, right? So aligning risk, business needs to again drive the security from the top down. So management needs to really drive this. I've been in situations where working in IT, you tell them that we need to have X, Y, and Z in place to protect our data, but unless management's going to buy into this, it's just kind of a volcano waiting to erupt at this point. Creating policies and procedures, this actually would include your incident response plan. So what would you guys do if you guys are breached, right? Is there a plan and procedures in place? A team actually involved with coming from multiple areas, IT, HR, legal, somebody from management that would be able to run with an actual incident. Exercise your plans. This can be done in a couple of different ways. SANS and ISACA run yearly incident response tabletop exercises that you can actually sign up for. I think they're usually nominal fees, and they basically come up with scenarios like, you've been hit by a ransomware attack at 7 a.m. on a Friday, and then they run through some specific questions to kind of get the incident response team, internal business incident response team, kind of engage and figure out, okay, are we really equipped and prepared for this? And then again, you could do these for yourself as well internally. Yeah, and this helps test and validate your incident response plan, your procedures, and the readiness of your staff. And then with these, we're seeing more and more where to get cybersecurity insurance these days, you are going to need to have, an incident response plan. You are going to need to have, a team in place, and then to do that, also ensure that there's training and testing as part of that. Auditing it, so assessing the current state based on the current cyber landscape. Obviously, just keeping up with the trends and what's the latest hot buttons for people. What are people seeing out there in terms of attacks, and then adapting accordingly, right? So if you're not prepared, if you feel like you're not ready for ransomware and you just have the kind of the standard, well, I just have Symantec AV, or I'm going to using Microsoft Defender, looking at some of the new next gen antiviruses like from FireEye and stuff that do more of the holistic approach, more behavioral stuff than just a standard, okay, I'm just looking for specific file types. And then again, educating and training, right? Security awareness training of your staff. Very important. They are our weakest link these days. So whether you're doing ongoing phishing assessments, putting them through security awareness training, whether it's web-based or in person, educating them on the policies and procedures that the organization has in place. That's all part of this educational training and this whole kind of cyber culture. It's definitely worth being much more proactive than reactive, again, because again, there's definitely a savings of being proactive versus reactive. And I know I got to give Eric some time here, so this kind of last section we'll kind of go through here real quick. So, risk is everywhere. Obviously your most common threats is still malware is one of the biggest ones, distributed denial of service, data leakage, and that could be both internal and external. External, obviously, if they do a compromise of the network and they're able to exfiltrate data out of your network, or it could just be the disgruntled employee who brings in his USB key and takes, the organizational database, or heaven forbid, anything that could be like intellectual property. Another big one we're seeing is this third-party kind of cloud vendor risks that are out there. Kaseya, again, they were an IT vendor for multiple organizations and they were breached. So understanding that, if you are working with an IT vendor of sorts or another organization where you may share some sensitive information, you want to make sure that their security controls are in place. Mobile and web application stuff, obviously ensuring that coding practices are sound and those applications are being tested, and we've talked about, ransomware, and then obviously having strong controls around change management and project management. So if you guys are developing any code or developing specific applications, that you have a good process in place to ensure there's no vulnerabilities identified when those applications go to production. So kind of the impacts, information is a key resource for all enterprises. Enterprises typically, store data. They may share data with a third party. We see that a lot in the banking world where, they may do lending through a third party application. So sometimes they have to share customer data with that third party app. IT is always going to be an enabler of all of the stuff above. IT has to bear the brunt of, ensuring systems are hardened, security controls are in place, they're being monitored. And this goes for everything from the largest, Fortune 500 companies down to the little 10-person shop. Yes, the 10-person shop, needs to think about these cybersecurity controls as well. And even, anything we talked about today too, obviously can be brought into your personal life, right? So, the simple things I always bring out to people too is, obviously don't use the same password. I know a few of you probably are doing that. Even rotating your usernames, have a good password change policy in place, ensure, your firewalls are always updated. And then again, things like the Internet of Things, your thermostats, your refrigerators, can be locked down as much as possible. So kind of one of the big questions that come up, that get asked a lot is, where is our data, right? So data is everywhere in any organization, right? So I don't know how many of you actually do data classification. I should have made that a poll question, but classifying your data depending on your, the organization type. So you may have obviously public facing documents, you may have, sensitive intellectual property type stuff, and then you may have customer information, right? So understanding what types of data you have, that way you can kind of ensure that, okay, well, if I have client data and I have intellectual property, these need to be stored in an encrypted file share, limited access to those files and folders, right? Identifying, again, prioritizing those assets, that data could be sitting on a database, just a network device. It could be sitting on a large storage area network. Assessing those risks. So what is the risk if that data does get out? And then testing the controls against those risks. So ensuring that, okay, so if I know I have databases and those databases are encrypted, I can test that to ensure that nobody can get into it. And then, monitoring that over time. And this whole process, this last bullet here, wash, rinse, repeat, is basically the same thing, right? So, things change, technology changes internally, the threats obviously are constantly changing. So it's basically just repeating the steps on a day-to-day basis. Integrating your systems and integrating your departments. So again, this is just kind of overall view of, okay, our data is kind of the center point for all these different areas, human resources, production, finance. We feel just kind of key areas of any organization, and just ensuring that, classifying the data again, and then ensuring that the data is all secure as best that it can be. So again, then understanding the threats, right? So potential for gross insufficiencies in your data, potential for redundant systems. You do want to have a DR site to replicate that data, and you want to make sure that your data is as secure in your DR site as it is in your local production site. Monitoring for, any type of attacks, ensuring that upgrades and migrations of new hardware and even your software are being done on a constant basis, and even performing, data analytics to ensure, there are programs that are out there that will monitor even user access. So Eric may open up 5,000 files in a week, and all of a sudden next week he opened 25,000. Well, why is there a gap? We can it's a good way to kind of do some data analytics and figure out, what is he doing? Is he looking to leave the company? Is he looking to download some stuff? And, if you're going to be assessing your network, one of the things, there are typical frameworks. NIST is one of the biggest ones. They have various different work programs and frameworks available depending on what you sit. ISO 2007-1 is more of an international frame. HITRUST for the healthcare, HIPAA for the healthcare network. COBIT, if you're kind of that small and medium-sized business, usually works pretty well from a framework perspective. All right, so we got polling question number 2. Newly hired staff are the most likely to steal from your organization. True or false?
Newly hired staff. All right, false, 90%.
That's what I was hoping to see.
There we go. Good. We got a smart group here. So that is right. What I'm going to talk about today is the internal fraud. Like you said, Joe kind of covered the external fraud. The profile of a fraudster, it is that long-time trusted employee. And the reason this is because they've been there so long that they've built up that trust. They're either in a management position or the effective internal controls have been overridden, where they can have the opportunity to commit fraud. So for fraud to occur, the fraud triangle, we need three things. We need a financial pressure or some sort of pressure. We need an opportunity, and then they have to rationalize it. The pressure, bills to pay, lavish lifestyle, things like that. Then there has to be that opportunity, that lack of control, so that someone overrides those controls. And if you have a long-time employee, a lot of times they can get those controls overridden. And then they rationalize it. Stealing $5,000 from Walmart, billion-dollar company, they can rationalize it. It's just, no one's going to notice that, or I work hard, I deserve this. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, the screen up. How is occupational fraud committed? Occupational fraud is just internal fraud. This is according to the ACFE 2020 report to the nations, which is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the gold standard in fraud. Every 2 years, they come out with this study. And so as you can see, asset misappropriation, there's three categories. According to the survey, 86% of the time it's through asset misappropriation, but when the fraud occurs, it's only $100,000 loss. Compared to financial statement fraud, it only happens 10% of the time, but when it does happen, it's almost $1 million fraud. And so over there on the right in figure 3, these are all the different, kind of small, all the different ways it happens. So financial statement fraud, that's your Enron scandals, cooking the books, over or under inflating financial statements. We're not going to get into too much of that today. The next one is corruption, conflict of interest, bribery, kickback. So this thing here to take away, conflict of interest, we're seeing more and more of this with our clients in what we're seeing out there in the fraud world. When you're going through your handouts, your policies, procedures, look to see if you have a conflict of interest policy. As you're hiring staff, or as you're awarding bids, can you award to someone that you are related to? No, it's okay if you can, but you have to disclose that. So just look at what your policy is. If you don't have one, look into it. We're going to focus most of it on asset misappropriation, cash, either taking cash or fraudulent disbursements, or inventory, misusing or taking inventory, because that does happen almost 90% of the time. So since it is the most common scheme, we're going to talk about that today. So this is our example slide. Numerous examples that I could go through. I'm not going to get into all of them in the essence of time and to give you guys some controls to take away, but some recent ones in the news that you've probably seen, the bribery and kickback scheme. This is a former Netflix executive, 28 counts of fraud and money laundering through 9 different companies. He stole over $500,000 for his lavish lifestyle, where they wanted to do business with Netflix. So he made them, throw a kickback in or pay him extra for them to do business with Netflix. Another recent one is Tyson Foods. There's a large cattle supplier. He billed Tyson Foods over $244 million for buying and feeding cattle that did not exist on his feedlot. The supplier is obviously huge. I think it's 2% of the United States beef. And he had 200,000 cattle that did not exist on his lot, but he was creating fictitious invoices to Tyson, and they were paying them for that. Tyson was not having the proper controls to check on the validity of these invoices and cattle. Where he spent, one would ask, where'd that money go, right? Well, he has lost $200 million in commodities trading, where he was hedging and betting on the commodities, and he ended up losing $200 million. So he had a gambling problem with his situation. Another one, if you guys have seen on Netflix, All the Queen's Horses. This is roughly 2013, a famous one, Rita Crundwell, the Dixon, Illinois comptroller, where she took over $53 million over 20 years from a small city in Illinois to fund her lavish lifestyle, where she had a world famous quarter horse farm. And she did this through just setting up a fictitious bank account, transferring money from the city to that, and creating fake invoices to cover that up. And the last one to touch on briefly, it's a personal one that we've handled, an inventory theft, where there is a hospital in the United States. They lost over $1 million from this hospital in inventory, and it wouldn't be what you think, right? It wouldn't be narcotics or some sort of expensive drug. This hospital lost $1 million in inventory from printer ink cartridges and diabetes test strips. This person was responsible for all the inventory, And what they did is they took the inventory, they adjusted it off, but they sold it all through eBay back in the day, and bought, took it for free, sold it a half price, sold $1 million. They ended up using it all at a casino and gambling it away, and they got 10 years in the federal prison for that. But when you think of a hospital, you don't think of printer ink cartridges as being valuable, but in this situation it was. So be mindful of what your inventory is. Next slide. 85% of all fraudsters displayed at least one of these behavioral red flags in this study, in this ACFE study. You can see 42% live beyond their means. This is the #1 red flag. We talk about lavish lifestyle. If you have a bookkeeper or accountant, anyone that makes, say $50,000 and they have 3 houses or pull up in a $100,000 sports car, it doesn't mean they're a fraudster. Doesn't mean they're stealing from you. All it means is, hey, I should look into this a little bit, right? Do they have other means? Do they have a spouse or, independent wealth? Very well could be. Or are they the ones responsible for all of your, receivables? Do they control all your accounting, your finances? You need to check your control. So just something to be mindful of. Living beyond your means is the clients we help and the victims. I get that all the time after the fact that I should have seen it coming. They had season tickets to this sporting event, or they had this lake cabin and this mountain cabin. I thought, how could they afford it? But then no one ever asked the questions or look into it. So ask the questions. Just look into their job duties and what controls around their job duties. Financial difficulties, 26%. Once again, many people have financial difficulties. Does not mean they're stealing, but if they are, just make sure there's not that opportunity, that fraud triangle. Close that out so they can't steal. Just a funny little slide, this expense to Fantasy Island, ask the obvious question. If you see something, just ask about it. Polling question number 3, does your organization have a confidential hotline or some sort of confidential reporting mechanism for employees? All right, so 51% is yes, 39% is no, and 11% not applicable, which hopefully that's maybe a sole proprietor business or other situation, because a confidential hotline is the #1 way tip is how fraud is detected. It's not detected through your financial statement audit. Financial statement audits are there to tell you if your business is profitable, or if you're following standards, or if it's if your business is going to keep succeeding. Confidential hotline, people down on the floor, they know what's going on. You need to allow employees to report that. There's some famous people and fraud investigators, when they go in and talk to people, they talk to the janitors, right? They talk to people that are there every day that can see who's there at 9, 10 p.m. at night. Why is the accountant still here at 11 o'clock at night? What are they doing? Well, they may be shredding records, creating records. You need to have employees have a way to voice those concerns, and confidential is the key word there. So if you don't have it, look into it. It's a service we offer. Other people offer it. It's really reasonable, a couple $100, but just give employees that voice so they can let you know what's going on in your organization. Types of controls, entity level. This is the tone at the top, by the board, by management, setting that precedent. And, do we take fraud serious? I've had an organization that had fraud happen twice, because the first time it happened, they didn't do anything. The person, just got fired. I don't even know if they had to pay it back. So what did that tell every other employee? Hey, it's okay to steal from here. Worst that's going to happen is you're going to have to pay back the money you owe with no interest. It's an interest-free loan. You're going to lose your job, right? Well, set that tone at the top. Hey, we're going to, take it serious. You're going to owe it back. We're going to turn over to law enforcement, those sort of things. Preventative controls. This is ideal, right? We'd like to prevent any problem before we have to deal with it. But we know organizations are small, businesses are small, we can't prevent it. Then the goal is the detective control. And what that is to detect it after the very first time it happens. Most frauds go on for 18 months before they're detected, 1.5 years. We don't want that to be the case, so we want to have a detective control. For example, bank statements, reconciliations. Say we can't have segregation of duties. Someone has a checkbook and can write checks, right? Well, we should have a detective control where someone independent that does not have that bank statement that's not have that checkbook is looking at the bank statements, but not just the bank statements, that they're actually looking at the canceled checks to see where the money is going. That way, if there's a personal check in there, we'd catch it the very first month. So that's an example of a detective control. Automated control, with IT, is there a way that people can't go in your bank account and do a wire transfer without having two people sign off? And then a manual control that just, takes some sort of process. So when you're designing effective internal controls, go through these kind of steps. I'm not going to read everything in essence of time, but I did want to put it down in the PowerPoint so you have it for the future. But review your systems, look at your vulnerable areas and identify the issues. The last one, consider cost benefit relationship. When we help businesses, I don't say, hey, you need to lock up all your pencils and sticky notes and things like that, right? That doesn't make sense. But, what is your most vulnerable areas? What's your, I start always with what's your most vulnerable area, fix that first, or what's your highest dollar amount, fix that first. And then from there, work your way down through your assets. So some specific controls, here's some general items on that confidential hotline, have that out there. Financial reporting, the perception of detection. Like we talked about, audits, if you have your business has a financial statement audit because your bank, requires it, that's not going to catch fraud. Auditors are looking at certain things, financial statements, but they're not looking at every single transaction. But if you have that perception of detection where you go up to whoever's handling the checkbook and say, I need to see this invoice, every now and then you just request documentation, that person's going to know that you're looking at things that they're going to get caught. I always use an example, no one robs Fort Knox, or you see a house with an ADT alarm system, right? The burglar's probably not going to go and rob that house. They know they're going to get caught. So have that perception of detection. Bank reconciliations, like we talked about, too many times we say, yeah, I look at the bank statements. And the follow-up question is, did you look at the canceled checks? Well, no, I just saw what it was coded in the accounting, so that's fine. Well, in QuickBooks and any accounting, you can put whatever you want there. Look at where the money's going. Look at the actual canceled check. Look at the supporting documentation for that invoice. Accounts payable. This is by far the most common scheme that we see. Credit cards. A lot of people I know businesses have credit cards auto paid. And so every month, whatever the balance due just comes out. It's okay if you do that, but the statements, whoever's getting those statements needs to be someone independent that does not have a card so they can see, because too often the statements either just come electronically or they come in the mail to the person that has the card and they can alter them or just throw them away and the bill's automatically paid. And so, if the owner's busy, it's 3 months before he ever saw a credit card statement, he's not going to know what was paid. So look at the actual credit card statements to see the charges, and ideally get that before someone else does. Expense reimbursements, once again, look for receipts, look at mileage, gas charges. A common thing here we see is people double dipping in businesses where they are submitting an expense reimbursement. Personally, they said they paid for it, as well as they have a company credit card and they're charging the company for it. So for meals, they'll put it on the company credit card, and they'll also take that same receipt and say it's an expense reimbursement and get paid for it when they use the company's funds. Inventory, equipment, I kind of gave you that example. See what's relevant to your specific business industry, what you have. If you have, we've seen it where, pickups, trailers, people take that home on the weekend for personal use and, it depreciates. They beat it up, it gets miles on it, whatever specific to yours, or someone can take and sell what's easily accessible, use it to your specific business, and then just see how is it secured? Is there cameras? Even if you don't have cameras, maybe put up fake cameras just so you can tell people we now have cameras over inventory. They don't know if that wire's hooked in or not. That perception of detection. You got to be careful though. You don't want cameras all over and people thinking that you're constantly staring at them, because that'll create a hostile work environment. So you got to be mindful of that, but just kind of assess your own risk there. Accounts receivable, when the money's coming in, who's preparing and sending customer bills and who gets the mail. You don't want the same person getting the mail also logging all the cash and checks entering into the system, making the deposits, because then obviously they'll just take the cash and they'll just do an adjustment or write off for that bill so that customer doesn't keep getting billed since they did pay it. So if that is the case, look at your adjustments to see then. Another way we've seen it is individuals stealing cash and then replacing it with checks, so the deposits match the amount that should be, but there's no cash ever on the deposit slips, like a lapping scheme. Your deposits, who performs them, prepares them, reconciles them, is the same person that goes to the bank, makes a deposit, entering them in, or do you have two different people to make sure that everything that left the business actually got into the bank account? Payroll, new hires and termination timesheets. Do we have fictitious employees? Are we giving ourselves raises or bonuses? A common feedback I get here is I look at the bank statements, I'd see if they got an extra, $2,000 a paycheck or this and that. My response to that is, okay, but someone could give themselves, I don't want to give you ideas here, but someone could give themselves a raise and then you just put it into the IRS, you just increase your withholdings. So your paycheck is always the same, but you have this big, large extra money paid into the IRS. So when you do your taxes, you get a large tax refund. Therefore, if all you're looking at is checks, you're not going to see that increase. And most of the time it's commingled in your IRS payment. It's, an extra $1,000 a month with every other employee is not going to be significant to catch that. So really look at your whole payroll process. Ongoing monitoring, be constant with it. It's not a one-time deal where you just kind of do this and forget about it. Constantly be looking what's going on, getting feedback from third parties, from your auditors, from webinars like this, and reassessing as your business changes, especially with COVID. We had that with process changing, people remote. Okay, well then we have to reassess our new procedures and make sure we have controls with that. With that, let's see my slide. There we go. I'll turn it back over to Joe. That wraps up mine. There's a few takeaways to emphasize kind of the control piece, and Joe will take it from here.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and there's a lot of information. I think Eric and I could talk about this all day. Just kind of, we enjoy talking about this. We like helping our clients, but some key takeaways here, IT internal controls are not a one-size-fits-all proposition, right? So, the 10-person shop, they need to have certain controls in place to protect their data, but they're not going to need as many as, you think of the Fortune 500 companies or even Fortune 1000 companies, right? Or even clients who are heavily regulated. Building a security strategy, using some type of framework, whether it's NIST, COVID, and then having a risk assessment, right? Identify all your applications and services, identify what risks and threats are possible with that application or system, and then what mitigating controls do you have in place, and then what's that residual risk look like? Building a monitoring plan, about doing ongoing assessments. Usually you'd want to do those from a third party, just to get a bird's eye view of what's going on. Sometimes IT can see things through rose-colored glasses. So having that third-party independent review of your security systems is definitely ideal. And then, again, this process never sleeps, right? I mean, it's just an ongoing thing. Attackers are getting more and more sophisticated. Vulnerabilities are ramping up by the day, the week. And breaches are happening at record numbers. So obviously no one can sleep on, ensuring your data is secure. From things that Eric talked about, most frauds are uncovered by accident. Don't overlook those obvious signs of fraud. Basic principles, right? People rarely commit fraud if they think they'll get caught. Again, going back to that polling question, it's not going to be that new person, right? It's typically going to be somebody who's established, right? And they probably have a little bit more experience of the systems in place and how to get around certain things. That perception of detection, right? What's the most effective deterrent to fraud? Ensuring that those are in place, and then just having well-established internal controls, right? Making sure systems from an IT perspective are all locked down and secure. People don't have more access than they actually need. Provide all your employees with an anonymous hotline that they can call in certain things, whether they're seeing fraud or they they think they're seeing fraud, which they should be able to call a hotline and be able to state their case, and get employee dishonest insurance. Just like I mentioned from the IT side, there needs to be cyber security insurance. I definitely agree on the employee side as well, getting that insurance as well. Again, Eric and I are available for questions. I think, here's our contact information. You can also reach out to Eric as well. Eric is the director of cybersecurity. I'm a manager in the area as well. So feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions. And I'll just leave it on this screen. And then, kind of open the door here for any questions from the participants.
There's one here that says, do you feel using software in the cloud is safer than on site?
That's a great question. You can talk to 10 different people and potentially get 10 different answers with this, but just what I'm seeing out there, I personally prefer having your data in-house. Cloud providers, there are some good ones. Like I said earlier in my presentation, Microsoft does a really good job of integrating internal controls with their cloud solutions. Amazon, is another option if it's done right, where you're securing your own Amazon Web Instance. I probably wouldn't have an issue with that from an auditing perspective. But from risk, there's definitely more risk, because again, now you have to take that vendor into account versus keeping it in-house and knowing that you can secure your data, at least using the least privilege mentality with your employees, encrypting data where you need to. So